I would like to dedicate this morning's shiur L'Ilad Ishmas, my grandfather, Rabbi Scheiner, the father of my uncle, Rabbi Scheiner, the founder, the supporter, the driving force behind his shul, a Makam Torah, a Makam Tefillah, a Makam of Gemilas Chasadim. My grandfather's yard site, his fourth yard site, is this Shabbos. Just a brief pointer. My grandfather, born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, as a boy went to Torah Vodaas and stayed there for the rest of his life. He was Marbitz Torah for over 50 years. A person that liked everybody. He liked everybody. It didn't make a difference what type of person. He liked everybody, and people felt it. If I ever was walking with him, people came from across the street to tell him a good Shabbos, to say hello to him. He liked people, people liked him. And he was able to relate to everybody and anybody. A Talmidim, a lot of Talmidim. Anytime he met a Talmud, no matter what stage of life and what type of person his Talmud turned out to be, he was able to relate to him, to connect to him. These are Medrash. The Medrash brings a machloikis tanoim. What's the most important pasuk in the Torah? Interesting. If you're asked, what's the most important pasuk? So there's a three-way machloikis. One Tana says, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Shema is the most important pasuk. Another Tana says, V'ahavta l'reacha kamoicha. So Kabbalah Malchus Shamayim, loving every Yid. There's a third Tana that says, Ben Pazi, from this week's Parsha, the pasuk Es HaKeves HaEchad Tasa B'Boiker. The pasuk of the carbon Tamuz, that's the most important pasuk. Which is very interesting. Of course, the carbon Tamuz was very important, but it's the most important pasuk in the whole Torah. And not only that, the Medrash says, Amad Reb Ploini al Raglov, and said, Halacha keben Pazi, that it's a keves echad tasa b'boiker. What's so important of the carbon Tamuz? Shema Yisrael Kabbalah Tzal Malchus Shamayim, we could understand. V'ahavta l'reacha kamoicha, Avos Yisrael, we could understand. The carbon Tamuz. So the Maral explains that it's a yesod for Yiddishkeit. The carbon Tamuz is tmidius. A person to be consistent, to do whatever he has to do in Avodas Hashem on a daily basis. Not only when he's in the mood, does he daven, does he learn, does he do chesed. A person does it day in, day out. Like over here, the morning koil, the Olam comes every morning, hot, cold, snow. My grandfather was that way, learning on a regular basis, on a daily basis, literally till the end of his life in Torah Vodaas. He never changed davening. He was always early to davening. He never changed. It was always a tmidius, his way in life, his chesed, his achnasas orchim, throughout his whole life. We're holding now, today Friday, between Shavasa BeTAMMUZ, that was yesterday, and tomorrow, Shabbos Kodesh PARSHAS PINCHOS. The Gemara, it's a Mishnah, in our Masechta. It's not this week's staff, but if you'll allow me, it's in the Masechta. The Mishnah in the beginning of the fourth parak, the Mishnah says, what happened, Shavasa BeTAMMUZ, that we fast, what happened? So the Mishnah lists out 5 things that happened. One of the 5 things, says the Mishnah, that Klal Yisrael no longer brought the carbon Tamuz in the Bais Medrash. Batal HaTamid. The carbon Tamuz of this week's Parsha, we stopped bringing the carbon Tamuz. And that's one of the sad things, what we're being mis'abel on Shivasa BeTAMMUZ, that we no longer bring the carbon tamid. We mentioned that in the Slichas yesterday, and we said Batal HaTamid, the Lashon in the Slichas, Batal HaTamid. Interesting, it doesn't just say Batal HaTamid. Another line or two later, we said Ki b'shiva asa BeTAMMUZ batlu Lashon Rabbi, not only the Tamid, Oila v'zavach. Oilas Tamid, the Oila is the Tamid was Batal. In other words, from Shivasa BeTAMMUZ on, we no longer brought the carbon tamid in the Bais Medrash, an extremely big void. But also Zavach. What's Zavach? Zavach Shlomim Karbonai, the Shlomim. So not only did we stop bringing the carbon tamid, we stopped bringing the Shlomim. Further, we also said in the Slichas yesterday, Ki b'shiva asa BeTAMMUZ batlu Karbonais. We stopped bringing Karbonais. Why did they stop bringing the Karbonais on Shivasa BeTAMMUZ? Now, we know the story behind why they stopped bringing the carbon tamid. They really had a hard time bringing the carbon tamid up until Shivasa BeTAMMUZ. Yerushalayim was surrounded from ASUR b'tevis 2.5 years before that. And they had a hard time getting the kvasim to bring in a carbon tamid. They paid a lot of money. They used to let down a box of money over the wall, and they used to get the carbonos, the carbon tamid, to be able to makriv on a daily basis. Till they were advised on the other side that, you know why you can't get into Yerushalayim, because the carbon tamid is protecting Klal Yisrael. So stop giving them the carbon tamid. That's what happened on Shivasa BeTAMMUZ, when they let down the money. Instead of a carbon coming back up, the Gemara says a chazer came up, so they no longer had the carbon tamid. But what's about the other carbonis? So the tamid they stopped. What happened with the other carbonis? If they no longer had carbonis already for a year, let's just say, and the only carbon that they brought was the tamid, so what does it mean what we said yesterday in the Slichas, Batul HaKarbonis, other carbonis? We didn't bring the other carbonis anyways before. It seems like they did bring other carbonis and it stopped on Shivasa BeTAMMUZ. Why did they stop the other carbonis? The tamid we understand, they didn't have the carbon tamid, so it stopped. But what's about the other carbonis? So the Ohr Chaim HaKadosh explains, not this, but he explains, the Ohr Chaim HaKadosh's yahrzeit was this past Tuesday, Tesvav Tamuz, and he explains on this that the pasuk says, Tzavas Harves Banav Leima Zois Teiras Ha'oila, the carbon oil of the Tamid, and PARSHAS Tzav. So Rashi brings from Chazal that you need more zeros by carbonos. What's Tzav Lashon zeros to take caution, because carbonos cost money. So b'mokim sheyesh chasar and kiss, it costs money. People should not bring carbonos, slack off about it. Zeros to be careful. Rashi. The Ohr Chaim explains, and it takes it a little further, and he says that being that we have the drasha ha'oila, that the first carbon for the day is the carbon oila, and if you do not bring a carbon oila, you cannot bring any other carbonos. You really have to make sure that you can bring the oila, even if it'll cost you a lot of money. What is the zeros to pay a lot of money for a carbon? Because a carbon costs a couple $100 a year. That's how you can understand. But says the Ohr Chaim, you know what the zeros is? The only way you could bring carbonos throughout the day is only if you have that first carbon, the carbon tamid. So even if it'll cost you thousands of dollars to bring that carbon tamid, you still have to do it. Because if you're not going to bring the carbon tamid, you're not going to be able to bring any carbonos. So therefore you need a zeros to make sure to bring the carbon tamid, spend as much money as needed to bring the carbon tamid so you can bring other carbonos. And that's what he says, that's what happened up until Shavasa BeTAMMUZ. They let down a crate of money, a lot of money, to get the carbon tamid, so they should be able to also bring the other karbanos. So what's the clear takeaway from the Ohr Chaim HaKadosh? That when we have the drasha ha'oila, that you could only bring, that you bring the carbon oila first, it's not only that it's first, it's ma'akev. If you don't bring the carbon oila, the mizbeach is closed for the day. There are no karbanos. Clear. So back to what we said yesterday in the slichas, batal atamid, that we know. The Mishnah says batal atamid because they no longer were able to bring the carbon tamid. But because they were no longer able to bring the carbon tamid, memelu was batal the other karbanos as well. Very clear. They brought the other karbanos up until Shavasa BeTAMMUZ. But once there was no carbon tamid, the mizbeach was, so to speak, shut down, and they did not bring other karbanos. So that's what we said yesterday. Batal atamid, batlu tamid, the oil and the zevach, and batlu ha-karbanos, because if there was no tamid, there was no other karbanos. The thing is that it's not so simple, this din, this concept, that if there's no carbon tamid, you no longer bring any karbanos on the mizbeach. This that the Ohr Chaim says you don't, it's closed, the mizbeach is shut down. The Svasemis in two places in Shas is mesupik about it. In Psachim daf nun ches and in Zvachim daf peites, he's mesupik. What happens a day in the Bais Medrash that they didn't bring a tamid for whatever reason? They didn't have any kvasim, they couldn't bring a tamid. Could you bring other karbanos? The Svasemis' son-in-law, Rabbi Yaakov Biederman, is magia on the Svasemis, and he says, these are mafurish Gemara, the Gemara in Erechin, Daf Yud Aleph Amud Beis. You can look up the Gemara yourself, but it's clear, that the Gemara says that even if you didn't bring a carbon tamid, we still brought other karbanos. It's mafurish. Later, after the Gemara derived in his pirush on Mesechtes Tamid, just read the Lashon, he says clearly also that if there was no carbon tamid, we still brought the other karbanos. The Haida Amar She'ein Lecha Davar Kodim L'Tamid Shal Shachar, when we say ha'oila that the carbon tamid comes first, and there's nothing before that, Hainu Bizman Shahoya Tamid Shal Shachar Karev. If you brought a carbon tamid, that was first. However, Avo Bizman from the Rishonim, he spells it out clearly, Shalohoya Yochal Liyos Karev. You weren't able to bring it. Kigoyin, he brings b'mei love that they couldn't bring a carbon. They didn't not bring the other karbanos. They brought other karbanos. Rabbi Chanan and Kavit Shrum speaks about it clearly. Also, that they brought other karbanos. So this that we said from the Ohr Chaim that they didn't bring other karbanos. L'chayr, it's mefurish in the Gemara that they did. They did bring other karbanos. So first, let's try to be miyashiv the Ohr Chaim, and then we're going to get back to the lashon of the slichas. The Ohr Chaim that says that they didn't, the Divrei Yatziv, the Kloisenberger Rebbe in his Shuvas is miyashiv the Ohr Chaim, and he says the Ohr Chaim doesn't mean to say that they didn't bring it if they didn't have a carbon tamid. It just means that it's so important, and that's Tzav Lashon Zirus to make sure, even if it costs a lot of money, it means to say that the tamid has to come first at any price. No matter how much you have to pay, you have to bring the carbon tamid first. But of course, if there was no carbon tamid, we still brought the other karbanos. This that the Ohr Chaim says, Kagoin Bizman Amigdal, now till Shavasa BeTAMMUZ they paid a lot of money, it doesn't mean that when you couldn't get a tamid, you didn't bring other karbanos. We brought other karbanos. We did bring other karbanos. But you have to make sure to bring that tamid at any cost. So the Gemara in Erechin that says that they brought other karbanos, of course they brought other karbanos. But they only brought other karbanos without a tamid. If there was absolutely no way how to bring the carbon tamid, then they brought the other karbanos. So that's a good yishuv on the Gemara, on the Ohr Chaim from the Gemara. But what's about what we said yesterday in the Slichas, Batlu HaKarbonos? Why was it Batlu HaKarbonos? The carbon tamid was taka bottle. But the other karbonos, why didn't they bring the other karbonos? Klal Yisrael did whatever they could to bring the carbon tamid. They let down a box of money, and it didn't work. So they did not have batal hatamid. The Mishnah by Asan Tainus is made batal hatamid. But why the other karbonos? I would like to share with the Olam a yishuv based off what's mavur in the Rashbash. The Rashbash, one of the Rishonim, the son of the Rashbitz, says a gewaldige chiddush that in the Midbar, throughout the years in the Midbar, Klal Yisrael did not bring the carbon tamid. They also did not like the menorah. Maybe once or twice, he says the second day Yom Kippur a few times. Klal Yisrael did not bring, so from the Rishonim, did not bring the carbon tamid, the menorah, the ketores. Abai have a Masada say the baracha, the order. There's no tamid, there's an order, the order is ma'akev. This is one of the Rishonim, you can see it inside, very crystal clear. My grandfather, my other grandfather, my mother's father, Ramotchi de Lubart, wrote a sefer on Kachim when he was 18 years old. Learned in Yeshivas Chachma, Lablini as Askamas from the Gedolei Adar, Rabbi Zalman, Rabbi Aaron. He brings the Ohr Chaim and he brings this Rashbitz and he says a big chiddush and he says that when you don't bring a carbon tamid, you don't bring other karbonos, how you could understand the Ohr Chaim kepshutai, is only karbonos tzibur. A carbon tzibur, the order, Abaya have a Masada say the maracha, all the avoidus of avoidus hatzibur was stopped. As opposed to a carbon yachid, somebody needed to bring a chatos, someone wanted to bring a shlomim, you could bring. That's how we explain Sibi Yashav, the Gemara in Erechin that says that they did bring karbonos, and the Ohr Chaim, there's a chilik, a carbon tzibur and a carbon yachid. As we see in the Rashbash, he says that when they didn't have a carbon tamid, he lists out avoidas hatzibur. Masha'ik, a carbon yachid, they did bring. Atkan is the words of my grandfather to be meyashav the Ohr Chaim. Let's jump right back now to what we were bothered in the lashon of the slicha that we said yesterday, that it says batlu hakarbonos. What do you mean batlu hakarbonos? Klal Yisrael was able to still bring karbonos, like the Gemara says in Erechin. Batlu hakarbonos means carbon tzibur. Oile v'zavach zevach is a shlamim. What's a carbon tzibur, a shlamim? There's one shlamim that was a carbon tzibur. We just had a little over a month ago, Shavuos. Kisvei Atzeres was a shlamim. So any karbonos tzibur, or what we said yesterday, batlu hakarbonos means karbonos hatzibur. All the avodas hatzibur in the Beis Hamikdash stopped, as opposed to a carbon yachid was brought. So everything is miyoshev. The Gemara in Erechin, the Ohr Chaim HaKadosh, what we said in the Slichas, Yoshev Mizbar. So really it's all good. We could stop right here. But Lamais in the title it said, what's the connection between Shavasa BeTAMMUZ and PARSHAS PINCHOS? So far we didn't really touch upon PARSHAS PINCHOS, though the Parsha speaks about the carbon tamid, but what's the connection to the Parsha? We really focused on PARSHAS Tzav, Zeis Teiras Ha'oila, Oila Rishayna. Tosfos in Zvachim Perek Kol HaTadir asks the following question: why do we need two psukim in the Torah to say that the carbon tamid comes first? We said in Parshas Tzav Ha'oila Oila Rishayna. Why is it necessary? In this week's Parsha, Parshas Pinchos, Tzavas B'nei Yisrael, we learn the Gemara over there in Kol HaTadir darshins from the Psukim Milvad Oilas HaBoiker. It's later, not in the Parshas HaTamid. Milvad Oilas HaBoiker, that you also bring the Karbanas Musaf, Shabbos, Yom Tov, besides the carbon tamid. What's besides? So the Gemara Darsh, it's a Mishnah. The Mishnah says first you bring the tamid, and then afterwards you bring the other Karbanas. So what do you have to have? Another drasha Oila Rishayna. Ki'ilu is a din that the Oila comes first. Frek Tosfos Teipak Lei. You have to bring the Oila first because it's Tadir, comes first. Tamid is every single day, the Tamid. And a Musaf of Shabbos, of Rosh Chodesh, once a week, once a month, of Yom Tov. So what do you have to have? The Pasuk in our Parsha and the Pasuk in Parshas Tzav. So the Achronim give Terutzim. The Mikdash David answers the following, and he says, from our Parsha of Tadir, that the Tamid has to be first, else din Kol HaTadir, Tadir ve'enoi Tadir. What comes more often? The carbon Tamid, that's first. You would be able to bring the Tamid and the Musaf at the same time. Tadir, what does Tadir mean? He declares a Shiloh. What does Tadir mean? Does Tadir mean that the Tadir has to be first, or it's just now let it be later? So you have to light the menorah and daven Meir of Chanukah. So there's a din Tadir, be'etzem there's a din Tadir. So what does the Tadir say? Tadir says that Ma'ariv has to come first, or it's just saying that you're not allowed to do Ma'ariv later. L'nafkamina, you have the carbon tamid and the carbon musaf. Is it only that it's now allowed to come later, or a dafka has to be first? L'nafkamina, could you do them both together? So the Mikdash David says, al tzedin tadir, you would be able to bring the tamid, carbon tamid, and the musaf together, because it's not, you're not violating the din tadir. It's only if you bring the tamid later you're violating. You can bring it together. Masha Enke in the pasuk in Parshas Tzav that says ha'oila oila rishayna, the carbon tamid has to actually come first. That's why we need the second pasuk. This is not so pashut, because Rabbi Chanan in Psachim says in the general din of Tadir, Tadir doesn't just mean that it's not going to be later. Tadir actually means that it has to be first. Rabbi Chanan Kavit Shurim Psachim Simin Reish Hey. Clearly, so then you don't have the teretz. What do you have to have both psukim? Our parsha that says that Tamid is first, automatically Al-Tzedin Tadir is telling us that you can't do it together. So after the pasuk in our parsha, Parshas Pinchos, why do you have to have the pasuk of a ha'oila oila rishayna? The Sfas Emes has a different teretz. It's actually in that shtickle in the Sfas Emes. The Sfas Emes over there in Zvachem says, and we spoke about the concept Chanukah and the Din Tader. Tader is only a discussion when you have both in front of us. Like the example I gave you for Chanukah. You need to light the menorah and you daven ma'ariv. So which one do you do first? Tader kaidem. If you're a person that davens ma'ariv every night, let's say over here in the night koil after night seder, 9:45. So the Paiskim, the Shiur brings it, then you daven ma'ariv later. There's no Tader. Tader is only when you have both shneim lefanenu. If they're not both in front of us, then it's not, there's no question which one. You do the one lefanenu. The Mela says the Sfas Emes, if from our parsha, of course the carbon atomid comes before the musaf. But let's say you don't have the carbon atomid lefanenu. If you don't have the carbon atomid lefanenu, so you'll bring the musaf. And when the tamid comes about later on, you'll bring the carbon tamid. For that, you need the pasuk in PARSHAS Tzav to say that no. Bring the tamid here and do the tamid first. Be makriv of the tamid, shech the tamid before the carbon musaf. But from our parsha itself, we wouldn't say that the tamid has to be first. It's only if shneim lefanenu. But I want to ask you the following question. I don't know if the Brisker Rav asked this question or they asked it to the Brisker Rav. L'may nafka mina, this whole part 2, what we just spoke about, that the tamid has to be first, even if it's not lefanenu, or you can't do it together. Both karbonos, the carbon tamid and the carbon musaf, which the pasuk says the tamid comes first, were both the same type of animal, was kvasim, and they were both called an oila. The din lishma, you don't have to have in mind for exactly what type of carbon. The only thing you have to have in mind is that you're bringing it l'shem oila. So l'may nafka mina that the Torah says that you have to bring the tamid before the musaf. When the kohen brought the carbon on the mizbeach, he had in mind l'shem oila. It was the exact same carbon, the morning, the tamid, and the musaf. So even if he was bringing the musaf first, he didn't bring the musaf first because he had in mind of bringing this keves l'shem oila. So if the right thing is that the oila comes first, it will be a tamid. So l'may nafka mina, back to the question that the tamid has to be first. The tamid was anyways first. The tamid was first because the only thing the kohen had in mind was that it should be l'shem oila. So there are 3 terutzim. Teretz number 1 is what we mentioned before, if you could bring it together. If you hold that you could bring it together, that's where it's noigeya. Even if you have a mind, if you're bringing them together, the opposite, I said it wrong, like Rabbi Chanan, you can't bring it together. If you cannot bring it together, that's where it's going to be negay. If you cannot bring it together, and you bring it together, over there it's a stira to tader kaidem. Another teretz, there was another 2 terutzim. There was a big difference between the carbon tamid and the carbon musaf. None of the actual carbon. Number 1, when you brought the carbon tamid, there was a halacha to bring wood, shnei gizrei eitzim, 2 logs of wood. So if you brought the musaf first, which means you didn't bring the wood, that's how you're showing that you weren't bringing the carbon tamid first. The same is also if you bring, the halacha is that the carbon tamid had to be checked for 4 days mavukar. Pashtas was even ma'akev. In other words, if you brought a carbon tamid that wasn't mavukar, wasn't checked, It was pasul. So if you brought the carbon musaf that was not checked, if you brought it first, for a musaf it would be good. For a tamid, it would not be good. So now that the halacha is that you have to bring the tamid first, it's very clear that you have to bring... What was the question? The question is, what difference does it make anyways? It doesn't make a difference. It doesn't make a difference, because if you bring the tamid first, you have to bring it with logs of wood, you have to bring a carbon that's mevukar. So to conclude and just sum up what we spoke, the first part of the shiur was the concept of this, that when you don't have a carbon tamid, you could still bring other carbonos, but maybe not carbonos sibur. Then we spoke about l'may nafkamina, that we need both psukim, that the carbon tamid is tadir, and then in Parshas Tzav that ha'oila oila rishayna, which of course, if you learn that you can't bring any other carbonis after the carbon tamid that was not brought, that's why you need both drashas. But we needed to find other terutzim, because if you could bring carbonis, the PARSHAS in the Gemara, then we have to understand why you need both psukim. And we concluded by l'may nafkamina that the tamid is first. They're both the same carbon. And for that we said these nafkaminas. Have a wonderful Shabbos.